So I'm Chris Adams. I'm the president and founder of Balancing Act. We make simulation-based public engagement tools. Primarily, we work on budgets, but we also do things for climate and for housing and so forth. And so I'm just going to share a little bit with you about my perspective on this. And I should say that before starting a company that does online public budget engagement, we had I've had since 1998 a public engagement firm that serves mostly governments in terms of trying to facilitate public engagement and public dialogues on policy, as well as sort of hot button issues like dog parks and things like that. So I'm going to share my screen and just kind of walk you through a few things, and hoping that we have an opportunity to have a rich discussion too. I'm going to try not to spend too much time talking. So the title of my talk is Why Budget Engagement Should Be Hard. And that may seem like a really odd thing for somebody who is making tools to title their talk with. And what I mean by that is a tool shouldn't be hard to use, but if you create the tool properly and if you put it in the right process, residents should walk away knowing and understanding that the choices you make can be agonizing. Hopefully they're not too agonizing, but they're very tough trade-offs that you're trying to resolve. I want to bring forth a couple of the themes that I've heard. This was a new slide that I just added today, just because I think it's relevant and important to kind of connect with what we've been doing. I had said that since 2015 or so, I've been working mostly to create simulation-based software, which in the terms of the previous conversation we've had, that might be considered sort of a thin relationship with people. But I really firmly believe that a tool is part of a process, a larger engagement effort, and that the tool can be used in either a thick or a thin way. And I hope those terms are familiar to people, but thin being maybe something that's just sort of passing and usually online, something like that, versus like a really intensive type of deliberative dialogue that might have people at round tables and might have different exercises to do and so forth. But what I'd like to pull forward from the summit is that that all of this should be seen as part of a process. And in particular, where I've seen the most success is where budget engagement is connected to goals and outcomes. And I really love the emphasis that GFOA is really placing. And I think a lot of governments are doing this already, but really tying together the budget process and the planning process and using technology, not necessarily budget simulation technology, but other types of technology that can really just help you be much more fine-toothed about how you're connecting what government is supposed to be doing and how that is budgeted. The other thing I've noticed is, and I love that throughout the theme of this the summit, is that budget engagement should not just be a standalone. Very few budget officers have ever had any sort of training or experience in public engagement, and so it really should be integrated into your larger communications and engagement strategies. And where we've seen the most success is where there's a budget finance officer who really wants to do this and has some motivation to do this, but also combines with the communications department and looks at the larger engagement strategy. And then this last point is just that budget engagement should be institutionalized and not episodic. We've had such a roller coaster the last few years. In 2020, it looked like the bottom was falling out of everything financially, especially sales taxes. And then in 2021, we had ARPA, and people were talking about having once in a generational investment opportunities. Now we're in 2022, and we're looking at the potential end of our, the cliff with ARPA possibly, but also a recession. And so really trying to just stay nimble so that you can have these fact-based conversations. And what we found is that if you frame it correctly, you can actually have productive fact-based conversations with residents about the budget. I've already talked a little bit about the thick and thin type, but I think it's really important to have both. And I wouldn't want online to be pigeonholed as just being thin, because I'm going to show you a couple examples in a minute of how it can be used in sort of a thick context as well as a thin context. And then this last point, there are a few budget officers, CFOs from around the country that have just been inspiring to me, who actually see budget engagement as a not to be missed opportunity to put on display the value that you're providing to residents, and to really let them know what you're doing, and then also to have a two-way conversation, to let them provide input to you on values, not on management or technical or performance type of things, but on values and priorities that then you as public administrators can then work into the budget and work into a management plan. All right. This is a quote from one of my favorite quotes from one of our clients. This comes from Dominic Casey, the city manager of Roseville, California. And this is in some ways how the title for this conversation was found about it being hard. The quote is, "Balancing Act gave our community a chance to sit in the city manager's chair and make budget decisions among all of the quality of life services we provide. people commented on how hard that role is. And that insight proved valuable in building trust. If you want to read their story, they won the GFOA Award for Excellence for an exceptionally well implemented best practice a couple of years ago. I'm pretty sure you can find it on the GFOA website without too much trouble. But that concept of budget engagement should be hard. We've seen that echoed throughout our work. And we actually do one for the federal government that we do in partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we ask an open-ended question at the end that says, what did you learn from doing from doing the simulation? And 50% of them say something to the effect of, this is hard. So we want residents, we want participants, we want stakeholders, when you're doing budget engagement, to not understand it's just an accounting exercise, or just a multiply by 2.3% to get your increase for the next year. We want them to understand that there are hard choices being made here. In some cases, they're excruciating choices, and we should be having a conversation about those. We should, and it should include technical things. It should include the cost of things, but also to the degree that it's relevant, to include values and preferences and priorities. And we think that's really important to do. And I love this quote. And if you get a chance to read their case study, they did some really cool things and did some things that were really hard. And they did it in partnership with the community because they had both a thick and a thin connection to the residents. One of the things that I talk about a lot is I talk about the 3 C's of successful budget engagement. And those 3 C's are constraints, context, and consequences. And so, they're really not too mysterious, but we found if you attend to those 3 C's as you're thinking about what you're going to do, you have a much higher likelihood of succeeding and meeting your goals. And so the first constraint is the first C is constraint. So most obvious one is you can't spend more money than you have. The second one is context, which is to let people know what government's doing. Give people a little bit of background. If you have some funny revenue options, let people know what some of those concerns are. There's been a lot of concern about equity and revenue options lately, and let people know about those. Or maybe you have some constraints about how much you can raise taxes. Let people know about those things and educate them about them. And then the third one is consequences, so that people don't just see this as a numbers game, but you actually give people a sense of what would happen if certain budget decisions were made. Give them a little bit of an example of what a cut would look like. If you're going to balance the budget on the back of trimming hours from the library, well, let people know that means libraries may not be open in the evenings any longer, and let them wrestle with that, as well. As don't just make that your problem, let them wrestle with it too. If you're interested in the 3 C's, there's an article that was, there's been a couple of articles on this. This one was in the University of Illinois Chicago's Government Finance Research Center. I'm actually going to pop into chat, I think, if I can do it here, a link, and maybe this will work well, but maybe there we go. No, it didn't. I will get it to you all later at some point, but it just explains this a little bit more. And then now I want to move on to just looking at some of the tools that we've created. So as I said, we were a face-to-face organization did face-to-face public engagement, what a lot of people would call the thick kind. And we have now expanded to create these tools that can be used to let people know, to let people wrestle with these trade-offs themselves. I want to show you a couple of those now. So I'm going to escape out of this. I'm going to show you a few examples. So I'm going to show you 4 examples. I'm going to go kind of quickly. I'm not going to try to show you everything, but I just want to illustrate a couple of concepts. So this is the Cherry Creek School District. This is actually from 2020. So this happened right before COVID took over everything for a couple of years. And at that point, they were looking at a projected structural deficit. And so they wanted parents and teachers and everybody to understand what that looked like and to look at what some of the choices were. And I really like the way that they framed this. They started out in a deficit, and there's actually some really great research coming out of the University of Kansas that shows that if you start your budget engagement with either a deficit or a surplus, but in particular a deficit, that it doesn't cause people to lose trust in you. What it does is it actually invites people to help be problem solvers, and we've seen that over and over again as well. So they've got, this is the balancing act simulation product. And so it starts with constraints. So the top bar is what we call the balance bar, and this moves as you make choices below. And the constraint is that you can't propose a budget without solving the deficit. Down here, you've got some spending items like certified staff, teachers basically, and over here you've got revenue. And so this was actually put together by David Hart, who's now the CFO of LA Unified School District. He's a real leader in the field, I think. And he wanted residents to know that, gosh, unless we can fix this, we're going to have to make some really hard choices, and we don't think you're going to like it. And so help us come up with other solutions, possibly. And so down here, you've got certified staff. They provide context. They describe what this is, staffing ratio. That's what a lot of parents think about when they think about their child's educational experience. And they let people play with that a little bit. And so currently, the status quo is that they're at 18.75, but they could change that possibly to 19 or 21 or whatever any of these choices are. Each one of these has a value associated with it. So if you're okay with having a higher ratio, you can actually save yourself $22.5 million, and you've begun to whittle down the deficit. So they've done other things as well. They've got mental health, and they've got nurses, and they've got security, and just a number of different options. They're letting people weigh in on whether or not COLAs should be passed on to employees or not, and things like that. But then over here, they also want to let people know that there is an option to sort of cutting your way out of this. And so they've got the option to have to increase the mill levy. And so they start out without having a mill levy override, but they say, you know what, if we're willing to pay $100 on a $400,000 home, and you can describe what that would look like, that would actually get us $30 million. And so with the changes we've made on the revenue side, we've actually just worked our way to a balanced budget, or even a little bit better than that. And so they really wanted to have this fact-based conversation with people. One reason why I wanted to show this example is that 2.5 years past, we're now, school districts are often across the country are looking at declining enrollment, and they're going to be making some hard decisions themselves, either asking residents and more, or looking at some consolidations, or just some tough trade-offs. And I think this is actually an effective way to do that. I want to show you St. Paul, Minnesota. They've been a really fun client to work with. They are very smart in what they've done. They've actually isolated some of the tough trade-offs. So whereas the school district I just showed you presented a lot of there's a transparency effect, as well as a trade-off opportunity, participation opportunity. What St. Paul did was that they wanted to say, let's not really muddy up the conversation by sort of showing everything. We don't need to have transparency in the simulation. What we really want to do is we want to focus people on the trade-offs, and we want to let them wrestle with those trade-offs, understand what they are, indicate what their preferences are, and if it means that we need to raise taxes, we want them to know what that looks like and to be okay with it. So in this instance, the mayor created a little YouTube video and put it on here, just sort of asking people for some kind of participation. And then they have a little bit of a different type of simulation. So you start out by seeing that you are in deficit, and which is explained in the video. And they say, we have an annual $3 million structural gap in our budget. And so and they've padlocked this so that people can't change that, because that's just something that is. And so in some ways, it kind of takes it off the table, as well as the general operating things, the things that are really not that controversial. It sort of takes that off the table. And what the benefit of that is they then get to go to these items over here, like community resources, and they can look at housing options. And they can click on that, and it says this would be more homes for low income and unsheltered populations. And you can say, yes, let's invest $2 million in that. And so as you can see, that amount shows up over here, and your deficit has just gotten worse. It went from 3 million to 5 million. What if we wanted to add activities at the recreation centers? These are decision items. And they describe what that, there used to be a link there, I think it must have gotten taken away or something like that, or a picture. And so they can do that at $500,000. You can look at infrastructure, and you can look at sidewalks and bike lanes. And these are things that they would love to do, but they're just not so sure that they have the funding to do it. And then over here, you can, a program to address gun violence. And then, the idea here is that you talk about the things that are most important to you, and then it asks that classic question of governing and economics, which is willingness to pay. So if people are saying that they want these things, are they willing to pay taxes to pay for it? And so they've got some really neat ways to think about that. They've got things like permits and fees over here, and they've got some questions. But really the one that is most important that they want to drive people's attention to is property tax. And so they've got an explainer of what that is. And if you increase this, they've got it set up so that with each click, it goes up 1.5%, which is actually a 1% increase in revenue raised from the property tax. And they're showing it to you up here. So they're actually using this secondary indicator portion of the simulation to say, okay, we just raised revenue from property tax by 1%, and they explain what that is. And so they say, and so you've actually just started to whittle this down a little bit. And so you can click it a couple more times, and you can actually get it so that you're balanced. And then they've got the impact on the median value home. And so what this means is that the median value home will be paying $35 more per year. And the benefit that's showing willingness to pay for these items that they've clicked over here and said that they wanted, such as additional housing options and so forth. So I actually think this is, we're really taken by this idea, because one of the constraints to creating a budget simulation like what Cherry Creek School District had is that it can take a while, because it's also a transparency tool. It can be a little bit complicated to build. This one actually just tees up the decision items with some costs, and then asks people how it ought to be paid for. I want to jump gears now. I want to show you Kenmore, Washington. Kenmore, Washington has done just a fantastic job. This tool was their ARPA engagement. It won an award from the Washington City Managers Association, and they've just done a fantastic job. They had amazing participation. I think it was around 8 or 10% of the entire population provided input on their ARPA fund. So they spent a little bit of time describing what this is, and essentially they're saying we have $1 million that we'd like to have the community provide input on. That's not the entirety of what they got for ARPA, but that's what they wanted to have the input on. And then you can go over here, and they're using kind of a lot of our advanced features where they ask people some questions. They ask people to drop a pin sort of near where they live, so that you can kind of get a geographic sense of where people are coming from. And so I'm just going to drop this pin. This is where I live in Denver. And then on the back end, you get a heat map that shows where everybody dropped their pin. And so here they basically said, we have a budget of $1 million, and we would like you to help us decide, should we do landlord and rent assistance? And so they describe what that is, and you can select it. Should we do a city hall playground and sport courts renovation? And they describe what that is. And it's going to have pickleball, which is kind of taking over the world. And then they even put a map up that shows you this is kind of what we think it would look like. And it's going to cost $680,000. So you can select it. That's great. But now you're down to only having $220,000 left. And you could say, I think we ought to do this subsidized program for pools, or for youth in the pools. Let's do something for a homelessness pilot project. Let's do this local assistance for local artists. And, that's, maybe we'll do one more thing. And now you're just about at the end. And then the cool thing is, this then tells you what has been included in your $1 million. And then you can go down here and you can actually then rank order it. And you can say, of all these things, the one that's most important to me is that city hall playground and sport court. And then you submit, and then on the back end, you get weighted and unweighted results. It actually even does an instant runoff voting technique. It's a really neat type of thing. I'm going to show you one more tool, and then we'll go back to the presentation. This is City of Pittsburgh. As I said earlier, I love this encouragement from GFOA and other governments to really much better tie together goals, outcomes, priorities, and planning with budgeting. And so the City of Pittsburgh is using this approach to just get input on what should be their goals. And so they have 11 items here, like infrastructure, housing, environment, cultural celebration, resident empowerment, lifelong learning. All these things are good things, but I think anybody who is managed or governed knows that if you have 11 priorities, you probably don't have any priorities. And so they're asking people to learn about these and then to select them. So instead of having dollars attached, it's really just collecting items. So you could say, I want to do housing, and I want to do environment, and I want to do resident empowerment, economic mobility, and then I'm okay. And then they could have limited this to only 4 inputs, but they're letting people do all they want. And then over here, you can have a suggestion. And then you can say, these are the things that I really want to focus on. I like having housing first. I think I'd put environment third, and I want to have economic mobility second. So we love this. We've seen a few. This is a relatively new feature. City of Austin has used it for some purposes like this. We've got some cities in Australia that have been using it this way, and it's actually been really fun. All right, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint presentation then. I apologize, I'm talking so quickly. It's kind of how I do things when I get excited about something like budget engagement. And I just want to talk about how we see this process, sort of the implementation of it. I mean, I love what Shane and Martine and Valerie have been talking about with all the theory and the whys, and I think that's critically important. But we've actually been thinking a lot about practically, how do you do this? And we see 5 stages. So there's a plan and a plan, what are you trying to do? And once again, incorporating the right communications people, finding the right people to do this, think about what data you want to present, really think about what your message is when people do the simulation. So typically people take about 10 or 12 minutes to do one of our simulations. What is it that you want them to ultimately understand? I mean, for a lot of people, a lot of public administrators, they just simply want people to understand this is hard. and they want people to, have a baseline understanding of the budget. They don't need to become budget experts, but they just want, baseline understanding and just understand this is hard. And then they do want some input on some preferences and priorities. But it's almost like the experience of spending 10 or 12 minutes wrestling with this is what really, I think, provides the value to a lot of local governments. And then build it. So obviously building the tool, engage, and then they engage, sort of present it to folks, and what's your strategy with that, and then communicate it, and then to come back and evaluate and see what you have. The part that we focus on the most is the plan and the build, but we also have something. But I think if you get the plan and the build part, these other ones will follow. I wanted to connect with my earlier comments about thick and thin. So a lot of people think that online engagement is sort of, the definition of thin, that, people can go, they can click, and then they leave. And that's kind of true. And I think it's especially true if you're talking about a survey. But what I think is so cool about, the availability of high quality simulations that can be built relatively quickly and relatively inexpensively is that it brings in some elements of thickness and just a more complex interaction that takes into account the cost of things and what you can and can't do, and how certain choices foreclose other choices, and those trade-offs. That's where I think that the real value is. And I think that we track how long people spend on our simulations, and as I said, it's usually between about 12 and 15 minutes, and that's a lot of learning. And I think there are some elements of a thick engagement that way. But what I really love the most is when our tool is being used as a facilitation tool. And as I said, my background is as a public policy, public engagement facilitator. And what I love the most is when people are actually coming face to face. And so this is about 500 people, and they're using what we call meeting mode. It's a special feature on our simulation where you can say, let's just give a URL to the people in this room, and then let's display the results live up here. And then you can have a conversation about it. And I just love that. And so that's a really fun thing. With COVID, there was some nice innovation. This is City of Tacoma, where they used it online, and they had about 400 or 500 people on it, and that was really cool.